Peter Navarro joins me now from the White House. It is good to see you, sir. Your article has certainly raised some questions and interest by people. Before we get to your article, which we will in a second.
Mr. Quest, it is good to be here with you, sir.
It is always good to see you, whatever the economic weather, Peter. Now, the article you wrote, before we get to it, what do you make of Bill Dudley's article that he wrote, in which he basically says it may be up to the Fed to stymie President Trump in his re-election campaign?
I would say, in one word, atrocious. That was just really beyond the pale for somebody who served this country and talks about the independence of the Fed to so blatantly try to politicize it. But that's the way Mr. Dudley is, I guess. I think for me, Richard, what I try to do is look at the chessboard as a macro guy and what I see through 2020. And we start with the Trump 4 pillars of economic growth, which are the tax cuts, deregulation, cheap energy, and a level playing field on trade. And we think that gets us to at least a solid 2% rate of growth. And the good news then is all the other things you mentioned, which have some reasonable high degree of probability to advance us further. Let's just walk through that list again.
Right.
Congress has to do its job by passing the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. The virtue of that agreement from a Make America Great Again perspective is that it has provisions in there which will restore the supply chain and manufacturing to this hemisphere. We think that it gets us a 1.2% GDP growth, over 100,000 jobs, many of them manufacturing. So that's number one. In terms of the Federal Reserve itself, I think we generally understand that it raised too far too fast. The idea of them lowering rates is not the Larry Summers apocalyptic scenario of recession, but simply to make a strong economy stronger. We think if they lower their rates, that will help two ways. One, it basically will stimulate investment directly, and two, stimulate exports indirectly. Right. As you know, Richard, the dollar went up by about 10% after Powell started raising rates.
Right, but Peter, on that Fed point, ignoring Dudley's last paragraph, the gravamen of his article said, if the Fed's accommodation encourages the president to escalate the trade war, further increasing the risk of a recession. Are we entering a sort of a cycle where the president does tariffs, the Fed has to react? Therefore, the president knows if he does more tariffs, the Fed will push rates down.
I think that's a series of hypotheticals built on a castle of sand. If you want to talk about the tariffs, the purpose of the tariff simply is to address China's 7 acts of economic aggression, and you know what they are, Richard. It's the cyber intrusions into U.S. business networks, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, dumping products into our markets, the massively subsidized state-owned enterprises, the currency manipulation, and killing Americans with their deadly fentanyl. Those are the issues that we are and will negotiate with, and that's good news. I think bringing that whole argument as Mr. Dudley done, it's just silly. I mean, I think what we need to focus on here, and I'm sure what the Federal Reserve will do as Board of Governors, is make sure that this economy reaches its full potential without creating inflation. The problem with the Fed, Richard, is that it's basically trying to minimize the unemployment rate rather than maximize growth. And the problem is you can have a 3.6% unemployment rate at 2% growth, or you can increase the labor force participation rate by 1 million people, have 3.6% unemployment, and 3% growth. That's what President Trump wants. He wants 3% growth or more, and I'm giving you like 5 different reasons how to get there if we can go through them at some point.
Right, but Peter, the fact is, you're not going to get a disagreement from me that the U.S. economy is in excellent shape at the moment and truly motoring along better than any other major economy in the world. Yeah. You're not going to get an argument from me on that. But are you in danger of shooting yourself in the foot? Listen to what Senator Pat Toomey says. There's no question trade uncertainty is contributing to the slowdown. The Fed chairman says trade policy uncertainty seems to be playing a role in the global slowdown. Now, that trade policy uncertainty is coming from your policy.
So just to be clear, Richard, we do not accept that premise at all. It's a false premise. It's a false narrative. The big headwind we're facing right now, it's two headwinds. One, it's Federal Reserve policy raising rates too fast, which is hurting us directly through investment and indirectly through a currency effect. So that's a big headwind. The second headwind, of course, is Europe. And let's talk about my other bullish scenarios, because we are with certainty. We are going to get reduction in rates by the ECB and some quantitative easing. Now, if that strengthens Europe, that will certainly boost our export demand and growth, but only, and this is the chess match of central banks, only if the Fed matches those cuts. Otherwise, any benefit we might get would be offset by further currency effects. So I see the ECB in some sense putting more pressure on the Federal Reserve to lower rates. So that's bullish. Right. As far as I'm concerned. Now, look, the bigger thing is, since you're over on the other side of the pond there, is the German issue. You know the term black zero. It's Germany's policy of fiscal austerity. I think there's growing momentum both within Germany and across Europe for Germany to engage in a significant fiscal stimulus. Right. And that would help enormously the global economy as well as the U.S. growth rate. And then, of course, Brexit. What's interesting about Brexit is it's basically frozen some investment. People don't know where things are going to be, so they're waiting to see how that ends. Once that resolves itself by October 30th, that'll unleash investment, but it'll also allow us the opportunity of a free trade agreement with Great Britain. That's all good. I'm giving you all sorts of great bullish reasons why the stock market's going to hit over 30,000 and we're going to hit 3% growth, and that's how we see this.
Give me a date for either of those.
So if we get the USMCA passed in September or early October, and if we get a 100 basis point rate reduction by the end of the year, we will go over 30,000 on the Dow with ease. And then if all these other elements fall into place, ECB rate cuts, German fiscal stimulus, Brexit stimulus, China fiscal stimulus, perhaps even Japan a fiscal stimulus, I think we'll see a global economy that has had a temporary slowdown, which will quickly rev back up, and we'll have another virtuous cycle going on.
Are you at all worried that central bankers, they've got a bit of ammunition left? I mean, you know, the Fed has got 100 basis points, but you know as well as I do, Peter, that compared to traditional recessions or traditional slowdowns, 1% is not that much if you really need to boost an economy.
Well, I think that's why the fiscal stimulus for places like Germany and China are going to be an important part of the mix. I mean, we've had over 30 interest rate we've had over 30 nations reduce their interest rates since the start of the year. You can't do this all with monetary easing. That's why I think some of these fiscal elements are good. And of course, Richard, I mean, look, you and I would certainly agree on this. At some point, Europe's got to come to that moment where they realize that this welfare state over-regulation, over-taxation policies is holding back a highly skilled workforce and a great group of nations. But you know, that's a conversation for another day.
I think we'll put that to one side. The issue overall becomes one of strategy. in all of this. Everybody has pretty much the same goal. I want you to listen to what your boss, President Trump, said at the G7 when asked about this uncertainty, this strategy of seeming to, a negotiating strategy, going from one side to the other and back again. Have a listen, sir.
Sorry, it's the way I negotiate.
So my question is that a strategy? Is it a strategy to call President Xi an enemy one day and then say that relations are very good the next day? And then, you know, I mean, it's gone back.
It's the way I negotiate. It's done very well for me over the years, and it's doing even better for the country.
All right, now, Peter, I'm not going to ask you to comment on that strategy. He is, after all, your boss. But you will agree it is different to any strategy you've worked for from a public policy official before.
Certainly, the tariffs are central to the strategy of this administration, and they work in different ways depending on the situation. For steel and aluminum, we had to put tariffs on simply to defend our domestic industries against what was a flood and glut of international imports into this country. In the case of Mexico, for example, when we threatened tariffs, we literally got more done in 2 weeks on our immigration policy than any previous president had done in the last 20 years. And I think, Richard, you might agree with me on this. Absent the tariffs that have been put in place on China, China would never have come to the bargaining table and advanced this far in those negotiations. And as a fourth element of the strategy, we are seeing on a daily basis new investment come in from Japan, from Germany, other places in Europe, particularly in our auto industry, simply because of the concern of these countries over the possibility of auto tariffs. So President Trump is using the tariff strategy, I think, brilliantly. It's a great defense of this country. It has a long history as part of this country in terms of previous presidents. And yes, he's doing it different than any modern president, but certainly not within the context of the broad sweep of American history.
Peter, it is always good, and we're always grateful that you give us the time that you do.
It is a good pleasure to see you.